So, so just as we have only two papers in this session, so I think we can let ourselves for 10 minutes to take extra coffee, and also those who are following us online, you know, make yourself coffee and be comfortable, and we'll start 9:10. Okay, so we should start. I'm happy that you have this extra 10 minutes for a coffee, but we should start. As we don't have one paper, we change a little bit our schedule. We'll have a proper last coffee break, and for sure we'll end on time or maybe even earlier. So the first session today, and Robert.
So, welcome everybody and good morning. This is the second day of the conference organized by the Polish-Norwegian Elites project. For those of you who are following us online, I must say that the weather in Warsaw now is quite cold, just above zero, and it's quite misty. But our hearts are warm, our brains are clear, and we are ready for the two papers in this session. Each of them will have 20 minutes. I was asked by the organizers to keep on time, and I mean to do it. The first paper will be delivered by David Kalhouse, from the Masaryk University in Brno, and his paper is entitled Many Lives of One Man, the Transformation of Saint Wenceslas' Story in Medieval Hagiography. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone in Warsaw and to everyone online from Jičín in Czech Republic, because I'm staying with my family. So let's spend now 20 minutes with Saint Wenceslas in the Middle Ages. As there are quite many Saint Wenceslas legends, I will focus on the earliest one from the 10th and 11th century and say only a few words about the others. First, we need to introduce the floor, and we have to say a few words about the relationship between among the legends, which is quite complicated thing. Therefore, I prepared few pictures which
David?
would help us.
David, can I interrupt you? Would you mind using full screen for your presentation?
Sure. I'm not.
No? You are not in the presentation mode.
Yeah.
I'm just push the button at the bottom on right.
Well, I'm not sure if it works like because I have full presentation on my screen, so maybe when there is my my picture.
Okay, so go ahead.
I will try hide my. Maybe this will help. No, you still see me.
Okay, if it's like that, go ahead.
Okay. Before I I structured my presentation into 3 points. First, I would like to introduce the legends, speak about their relationship and about the manuscript evidence. Then I will focus on common structure of those legends, and as a last point, I will focus on the elements in the narratives that are specific locally or chronologically. Before saying a few words about the manuscripts, I would like to remind the audience that Saint Wenceslas was quite popular, a holy man in the Czech lands. He was depicted on the coins since 1000, thanks to the Polish prince Boleslav Chrobry, who became for a short time Prince of Bohemia. He was also depicted on princely seals since the end of the 11th century, And as far as we know, there were at least 14 churches dedicated to Saint Wenceslas before the 1250. So, according to Dušan Třeštík, who presented the last analysis of the relationships among the Saint Wenceslas legends, there was some lost Wenceslas legends at the start. However, we don't have its text preserved. So what we do have is the legend Crescente Fide, which is quite short, written in Latin.
David, I don't know whether you can hear us, but I'm afraid we have lost you. We are left just with St. Wenceslas, but without David, it's not the same. Okay. David, can you hear us? So I think we'll wait a minute for David, maybe two, but in the meantime, Anya, get ready, because if the connection fails, we'll pass directly to your paper. Okay. Grzegorz, in the meantime, do you have any contact with David? You will let him know. Okay, thank you. So, our first or second, I'm not sure how to count, speaker on this session will be Anna Dryblak from the University of Warsaw. And she will present the paper entitled St. Hedwig of Silesia, First Dynastic Saint of the Piast Dynasty and the Legitimization of Power in the Time of Change. Yes. So can I ask to upload Anna's presentation? David, we have decided to pass to the second paper and leave you time to resolve technical issues. So now Anna is at the pulpit and we will pass to your paper afterwards. But did you hear me, David?
Yes, I'm already back.
So,
sorry.
Yes. So, David, if it is fine with you, we have already asked Anya to take your place and we'll go back to your paper afterwards. Is it fine?
Yes, okay, that's no problem.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your understanding. And can I ask the organizers to upload Anna's presentation right now? because what we see is still David's presentation.
Thank you very much. Okay. The cult of a saint ruler didn't really existed in early Piast monarchy. Unlike many other Christian monarchies of the region, including Bohemia, Hungary, but also Scandinavian kingdoms, in Poland, we do not trace any examples of the dynastic cult in the almost 3/3 centuries of a Piast kingdom existence. First Saint Patron and at the same time member of the ruling family was Saint Hedwig, daughter of Bertold of Andex, and at the same time Henry the Bearded Wife and Duchess of Silesia from the beginning of the 13th century. Her husband was one of the most important individuals of the Piast dynasty in this period. In the 30s, also Duke of Krakow and Duke of Greater Poland. And we can say very much about his endeavors and achievements. On the other hand, sources from the first half of the 13th century, mostly diplomatic ones, do not give us many informations about the activity and role of the Duchess. However, we presume that she, along with her brother, played an important role in the implementing of the dynastic nunnery idea in Poland. Being raised in Kitzingen Abbey, having a sister who was an abbess in the same nunnery, she was certainly aware of the significance of female monastic foundations in the religious and political landscape of the duchy. In Poland, such model was not yet implemented by the representatives of the dynasty. But the beginning of the 13th century and at the same time the beginning of Henry the Bearded rulership was a very particular and difficult moment when, after his father's death, he had to face his uncle in the conflict over Opole, a part of his patrimonium. Moreover, in the beginning of the 13th century, we can observe progression of the Piast monarchy division. The situation called for new ideas, solutions which could help to strengthen the position of a young ruler and the fundaments of his rulership. With help of his wife family, Henry had therefore created a new stronghold, inaugurational foundation, a Cistercian nunnery in Trzebnica. The first abbess of the monastery became Petrisa, former teacher of Hedwig from Kitzingen. We do not know very much about the relations between monastery and Hedwig before her husband's death. Afterwards, she has certainly given to the convent some goods in Zavonia, although this property was going to belong to the abbess and daughter of Hedwig, Gertrude. To be honest, we do not have many informations about her activity in Poland from her arrival at the beginning of the 13th century up to her death. What we know is mostly a hagiographical creation. Interesting, of course, since the subject of my paper concerns her cult. So, what about hagiography? The hagiographical tradition informs us that after giving birth to her children, Duchess left her husband with Henry's consent and joined the community of Cistercian nuns in Trzebnica. Not as a nun, however, she was just living near the convent. As the hagiographer informs us, her daughter Gertrude was trying to persuade her to join the convent, but the Duchess wanted to preserve the right to give donations, help poor, in the same time staying near the monastery and being independent. From the group of 6 children she gave birth to, only 2 reached adulthood. Prince Henry the Pious, heir of Henry the Bearded, and and one daughter, Gertrude. Gertrude was going to be wed to Otto Wittelsbach. However, these plans, for various reasons and also considering the death of Otto, were given up. Instead, Gertrude was intended to be a nun and abbess in family foundation in Trzebnica. On the occasion of her vows, the nunnery received generous donations from her father, the prince. After the death of the first abbess, Petrissa, Gertrude became an abbess herself. She became a very prominent figure in Silesia. We have 80 documents issued by the abbess. Her activity even outreached the borders of Silesia. We can trace her in Greater Poland, where she was implementing the idea of the dynastical nunnery. Hagiographical tradition gives us very interesting record of her role as a dynasty representative. In the St. Hedwig Vita, she is discussing the place of Hedwig's burial with her mother.
This is fine. This is
It was. I was confused.
Right. Yes, I know.
For a moment, I was confused.
David, if you can hear
no
us,
problem. This is no
please stop sharing your screen with us. Thank you.
It's no problem. In the St. Hedwig Vita, she's discussing the place of Hedwig's burial with her mother. So humble Hedwig wants to be buried on the cemetery. After her daughter's objection, she's proposing the chapel of St. John, where the children of the dynasty were buried. But Gertrude is still objecting, proposing first as a burial place the tomb of her father, secondly the tomb of her brother and Hedwig's son, and at last deciding to bury her at the altar of St. Peter, so that the nuns can have her tomb always before their eyes. In the eyes of Vita's author, Gertrude was therefore a representative of the dynasty interests, looking after memoria, but maybe also thinking about the cult which should develop after her mother's death. Other sources gives us an information that Gertrude was really attempting to create a place of dynastical memory in Trzebnica. To give an example, from the document of the abbot of Lubiąż, we know that the general chapter on her request has given consent to, for solemn celebrations of the anniversary of her parents' death, but also of Gertrude's election as an abbess. This consent was given just after the accusation of the abbot of Paradise, who was complaining to the general chapter that the abbess is receiving pilgrims in the buildings of a monastery. No doubt she was active in the pursuit of her mother canonization and was one of the most important promoters of Hedwig's cult. Jadwiga died in 1243 and her cult was flourishing quite fast. In 1253, Krakow received his own saint. It was the canonization of Saint Stanislaus, first Polish saint. Great celebrations in which the dynasty, of course, took part. Although Saint Bishop of Krakow became undoubtedly the most important Polish patron, also later on in the context of the unification of the Piast rulership, he was nevertheless the saint martyr murdered by king, one of the Piast dynasty members. The saint member of the dynasty was in Poland completely new. Gaining favor of Pope Urban IV, who visited earlier Poland as papal legate, best efforts were undertaken to promote and legalize Duchess's cult. The commission were visiting Silesia in the 60s, examining the miracles of Saint Tubi, and in 26th of March 1267 in Viterbo, Pope Clemens IV announced Hedwig a saint. As the canonization bull states, he had done that listening to the requests of the dukes, people, abbess, and convent of Trzebnica. Thus, stating the Pope, Saint Hedwig became a special patron of Poland and of Poles. The canonization of Duchess made the place of her burial even more important. Her grandson, Archbishop of Salzburg, Władysław, took up the initiative and decided to build the new chapel consecrated to the name of St. Hedwig in the place of St. Peter's Chapel, where the most important representatives of the dynasty, including St. Hedwig, were buried. As he stated in his document, for the sins of his predecessors and his own salvation, he is granting privileges in relation to the building works undertaken in Trzebnica. The chapel, built from the initiative of Władysław and later under supervision of Duke Konrad of Głogów, was one of the finest examples of Gothic architecture in Polish lands, third Gothic building in Silesia. This new foundation was also responding to the new trends and architectural models from Western Europe, French and German Gothic, as art historians are jointly stating. I'm, of course, not an expert in this matter, but I would like to show you some examples gathered lately by Jakub Adamski. Of course, I cannot take credit for that, but I wanted to show you some similar foundations. So these are French foundations, but also foundations from German lands and Bohemian and Bohemian ones. So Adamski, analyzing the specific elements of the chapel, was showing that the Silesian chapel is in the first place benefiting from German examples and the Bohemian ones. These conclusions are very interesting from my point of view. They are showing that founders of the chapel took inspiration from the important dynastical foundations, which were in addition examples of new piety trends, followed by the representatives of the dynasty, especially women in the 13th century. Following the construction of the chapel, the translation of relics was organized. Polish dukes, with cooperation of the abbess of Trzebnica, Gertrude, and after her death, her niece, St. Hedwig's granddaughter, Abbess Agnieszka, following the example of their predecessor, Henry the Bearded, were therefore creating one of the most important centers of the Silesian sacral topography. This nunnery with Hedwig's chapel, Hedwig's tomb, was new and very needed sacral stronghold, securing power legitimization for next generation of Piast family. It is interesting, I think, to point out the message contained in the papal bull of canonization, Pope presenting St. Hedwig as a special protector and defender of Poland. He is also pointing out the element of dynastical sanctity, including the passus concerning Hedwig's son, Henry the Pious, and his death in the Battle of Legnica as a martyrdom. However, we do not have any information about the dukes from the other parts of Piast's Poland taking part in the canonization festivities. We do not have any remarks showing that in this particular moment they were interested in implementing the cult of St. Hedwig in their duchies. The author of Salomea's Vita is even informing that in the day of the translation of St. Hedwig relics, Duke of Lesser Poland Bolesław with his wife Kinga was staying in Nowy Korczyn, where they were listening about the pious life of his sister Salomea. In Greater Poland, we observed the occurrence of the name Hedwig in the local dynastic branch, and I'm thinking mostly about Jadwiga, future wife of future King Władysław Łokietek. However, we don't have any information about the participation of the Duke or his family in the celebrations on the occasion of canonization or translation of relics. So, why the cult of St. Hedwig was so important, and why was she presented, so to say, as a Polish saint? Of course, one can say that the dynastic cult is always important, vital, and cannot be overestimated. And it is true, of course. But Silesian branch of the Piast dynasty was in the second half of the 13th century in a rather difficult position. The region was getting more and more divided between members of a family. Silesian duchies were also focusing the attention of the Bohemian monarch. It is worth mentioning that Premis Ottokar took great interest in St. Hedwig's cult and was supposed to be in Trzebnica during translation of her relics. The dukes needed to underline their position and special right to rule, to underline the fact that they were dominus naturales in this region, even if they were making alliances with stronger partners. The dynastical foundations, convents preserving memory about their mighty founders, praying for them, were one of the most important footholds for power legitimization. But nothing could compare with the help and support of dynastic saint, giving to the family in this difficult turning point and invincible support. I would therefore say that being a Duchess of Silesia, one of a member of Piast dynasty, Hedwig as a saint gave Polish Dukes of Silesia new and undeniable right to rule these lands forever. The whole family was taking care of that. I would risk to say that it was less important that Władysław was Archbishop of Salzburg. It was more important that he was Dux Silesia in the same way that Gertrude, as an abbess of Trzebnica, was Ducis Silesia. As we can see, it was underlined in the diplomatic sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. Okay, so without further ado, we can start our second paper. So we can see David's presentation.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Again, I hope this will work better than before. I've experienced some technical issue probably with the signal. Strange. Nothing like that happened to me before.
It looks perfect, David, so go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Well, in my paper, I would like to focus on three elements. First, I would like to introduce the St. Wenceslas hagiography, say a few words about the relationships among the legends, and shortly summarize the manuscripts. Then I will talk about the commonalities in the structure of the legends, and at the end I will focus on those parts of the legends that were specific for each author and that tells us a lot about local and chronological anchor that anchored those concrete texts to the concrete milieu when they were written. But before I start speaking about the texts, I would like to remind you that St. Wenceslas was quite popular holy man in the Czech lands. He was present in the coins since approximately 1000. He was present on princely seals. He was remembered in preachings, and to him were dedicated at least 14 churches around 1250. In that time, we know about lower hundreds of churches, so the share of the churches dedicated to St. Wenceslas was quite high as well. And now to the legends. The latest analysis was presented by Dušan Třeštík, and I'm just now just summarizing the result of his and Jaroslav Ludvíkovský research. But it's necessary to understand the relationships among the legends for my further um, uh, presentation. Dusan Šeštík assumed that there was some lost Latin legend about St. Wenceslas, although that thesis is doubted now. There is no serious attempt to distract that thesis, so let's assume that there really was a legend that starts all St. Wenceslas hagiography. What's preserved until now is the short Latin legend called Crescente Fide, which is the basis for all later Latin hagiography. It became a source for legend penned by Gumpardi. He was a courtier of Otto II and became Bishop of Mantua at the end of the 10th century. Gumpardi and Crescente Fide inspired Christianus. It seems he was a member of Přemyslit family. He became a monk in Regensburg, and using Gumpardi, Crescente Fide, and several other sources, he penned his complex story. Legenda Christiani is a complicated thing because it's not only St. Wenceslas legend, it also includes the story of St. Ludmila, and it also shortly describes the beginnings of Christianity in the Czech lands. So it mentions Cyril and Methodius, and it also includes the short story about the beginning of the dynasty. So it's first information about Přemysl and Libuše before Cosmas of Prague, who are named as founders of dynasty. So Legenda Christiani is a text somewhere between the hagiography and history of the church. Surprisingly, Gumpardi's legend was a basis for an author of the second Old Church Slavonic legends about St. Wenceslas in the first half of the 11th century. So you can see that there was not just a there were not just Latin legends, but also legends written in Old Church Slavic, and that there were not strict boundaries between those two languages in the Czech lands in the 10th and 11th century. When I was speaking about the second Old Church Slavic legend, it's clear that there was also the first Old Church Slavic legend, which seems to be written in 950, maybe earlier, maybe later. There is a great discussion among the experts in Slavic philology and historians. And last but not least, we should also mention the legend penned by Laurentius of Monte Cassino, penned in Italy in 1140s or 50s. Surprisingly, from the existing texts, we can see many common motives and shared by Laurentius and the first Old Church Slavic legend, as it is doubtful that Laurentius spoke Old Church Slavic. It seems that both legends had some Latin basis they both could use as their source of information and motives. The scholars didn't stop writing St. Wenceslas hagiography in the 11th century. On the contrary, there is lots of other stuff written in 12th and 13th and 14th century. As you can see, the basis for most of these legends is Legenda Christiani. One important exception is the legend Oportet nos fratres, inspired directly by Gumport of Mantua. So Legenda Christiani inspired the author of Ut Annunciatur, the first redaction, Ut Annunciatur. Second redaction, there's also legend Orientiam Sole, which also exists in two versions. And last but not least, we should not forget the legend penned by Charles IV, the Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, around 1350. Regarding the manuscripts, I will start with the first Old Church Slavic legend. You can see that there are three versions of that legends, and I don't want to spend too much time with those manuscripts. What I would like to highlight is that most of these texts are quite late. The earliest are the text of the Croatian redaction, and those were written by the end of the 14th century at the earliest. None of those texts either was written copied in Bohemia. So we assume that the first Old Church Slavic legend was penned in Bohemia because the expert in Slavic philology share the opinion that the language is quite old, that it can be related to the 10th century. However, the existing copies are quite late and are quite late. On the contrary, the Latin hagiography and its manuscript start at the beginning of the 11th century. So the distance between the first copies and the beginnings of the cult and writing of the concrete text is not that big. Here I would like to mention especially the two manuscripts now preserved in Munich. It's CLM 4605 and 18547b, which both were written in Bavaria, in Benedictborn and Tegernsee, both famous Bavarian monasteries. The image you can see is, however, taken from the Passional of the monastery Zwiefalten, closely related to the Czech lens because the monks from Zwiefalten participated on the foundation of the West Bohemian monastery in Kladruby. In case of nearly all of those manuscripts, we can find some relationships to the Czech lens, although probably just one of those manuscripts was written in Bohemia or for Bohemian recipient, for the Bishopric of Prague. The oldest manuscript of the St. Wenceslas legend is the manuscript of Legenda Gumpardi. It was ordered by Queen Emma, wife of Boleslav II, Prince of Bohemia at the end of the 10th century, which was richly decorated and could have been used as a diplomatic gift by the Queen. And there are several other manuscripts from the 12th century. Problematic is the situation by the manuscript transmission of Legenda Christiani, because the only existing full text of the legend is preserved in one 14th century manuscript. However, there are several fragments related to to Saint Ludmila, called Recordatus Aviesue and Subtrahentesse from the 12th century. It's not surprising that the manuscript transmission provoked the experts to the long discussions about the authenticity of the legend, because there is a rich bibliography on the authenticity of Legenda Christiani. I will not discuss in detail. Similarly, the text of Laurentius of Monte Cassino does only exist in one manuscript from the 11th century. The manuscript transmission of Second Old Church Slavic legend is quite late, again from late Middle Ages and related to Russia. And Oportet Nostratres exist in 12th century manuscript. So in this case, they are contemporary with the penny legend. Let's see the summarization of the manuscript's transmission until 1200. You can see that there is a high concentration of those texts in today's southern Germany, and that there is no text of St. Wenceslas legend written in the Czech lands until 1200, as far as we know. What is the plot of the legend? Well, we will follow here the structure of Crescente Fide, which stands at the beginning of the whole Wenceslas hagiography. All or nearly all oldest Wenceslas legends start with the rule of his uncle and father, Dukes Pitihnev and Vratislav, who are presented as pious princes who helped to introduce Christianity in Bohemia and who built several churches. Then we can read about several virtues related to St. Wenceslas. The catalogue of virtues is quite traditional, so Wenceslas is loyal, trustworthy, fair, wise, patient, moderate, compassion to the orphans and widows. He supports clergy and his retinue. He handles foreigners as his own kind. Interesting is a sentence where we read that as a judge, he never condemned anyone to death, because this has, I didn't find any parallel in the hagiography. Maybe you can help me to find any, but this is an element which we can find in the canon law, because it was prohibited to the clergy to participate on the courts when and where anyone could have been sentenced to death. It seems that this element could be related to another element elements where we read that he barefoot pilgrim among the churches in Bohemia, barefoot, and venerated the saints and God in the church, in those churches, that he wore a rough hair shirt under his royal robe, and that he secretly prepared bread and wine for a mass. because he wanted to mirror the monks, and he himself wanted to become a monk.
5 minutes, David.
Okay. We are informed about his prophetic skills. His attempt to mirror the clergy and monks is confirmed in another chapter, where the Bohemian elites seem to be disappointed and try to prevent the clergy to access to the young prince. However, once Wenceslas became adult, he invites priests from distant regions, and he does not hesitate to punish those who disobeyed the god's order and law. And that helps him to become successful warlord. The only thing that prevents Wenceslas to resign on his throne is the intention to build a church dedicated to Saint Vitus. This is a surprising element because in mostly all of the legends, the basic conflict between Wenceslas and his brother Boleslav is due to the power and throne. So theoretically, for Boleslav, it could be enough to wait a few years, and Boleslav would have resigned and went to Rome, as nearly all the legends insist. And then Wenceslas is invited by his brother to Stara Boleslav, and although he is warned by a loyal man, he decided to stay and is martyred by his brother, and his followers are then killed as well. So that helps the hagiographers to build a parallel between St. Wenceslas and Jesus Christ or St. Peter. Now, when it seems that all the legends are similar, what are the differences? Well, if we look on the image of Dragomira, which is mother of Wenceslas and Boleslav, in the first Old Church Slavic legend, her role in murdering Ludmila is totally omitted. However, it's strongly present in all the legends. That's the first point. What's also a difference between those legends is the way how the princes of Bohemia access the throne. Whereas in Legenda Gumpardi penned for Ottonian court, the presence of the Holy Roman Empire is strong, and in every paragraph we hear that what happened, it took place under the reign of the Ottonian kings and emperors.
2 minutes.
Whereas in Old Church Slavic legend or in Legenda Christiani, these are primarily the secular elites from Bohemia who decide what takes place in the Czech lands. That element is developed by the author of Orientiam Sole, which mentions that Wenceslas was once invited by the emperor to the assembly, and as St. Wenceslas let all the guests and the emperor wait for 3 days, the emperor decided to punish him when he comes. But finally, when Wenceslas came to the court, emperor himself stood up and left his own throne to Saint Wenceslas, and princes of the empire were surprised and additionally asked the emperor, why do you did so? And he answered that he has seen a sign and an angel that introduced Saint Wenceslas to his court. And the author also stresses that Wenceslas didn't want to transform that success and that honor in nothing secure, that he only asked for the relics of Saint Vitus. So these tiny details tells a lot about the milieu where those texts were written. In case of Orientiam Sola, we can speculate whether it was related to the rule of Přemysl Ottokardus II, who had some imperial ambitions and wanted to use that legend as a tool of propaganda to stress the importance of his own dynasty and its possible rule to right the Holy Roman Empire. In general, it's interesting to look on the sociology of the legends, because how they discuss the murder of Saint Wenceslas.
We are running out of time, so it's...
Yeah, okay, I will say a few words and I will end. Because one group of legend stresses the role of Boleslav himself, who himself decides what will take place. In other legends, especially in the first Old Church Slavic legends, Boleslav is just a man seduced by a devil and by his evil counselors. So this again says a lot about how the author wanted to construct the image of the Přemyslid dynasty, because all future Bohemian princes were heirs of Boleslav I, so murder, not of Saint Wenceslas. So, and the last point is the problem of the relationship between the Prague and Regensburg bishopric, which again interestingly shows how the precedence of Regensburg was perceived in Bohemia and in the Holy Roman Empire in 10th and 11th century. But this will be developed in a written form of my paper. Thank you for your patience, and I will look forward for further discussion, which can maybe help to discuss some details omitted in my paper. Thank you, and
thank you very much, David. We have about 25 minutes for discussion, so I open the floor for questions. Let me, waiting for other questions, let me ask the first one, which will go to Anna. The question is quite general and asked from a perspective of someone who knows very little about your period. Was it easier to establish a cult of a female member of the dynasty than the male?
I not sure how to answer your question.
So
Not really.
let me say that I was thinking about the paper presented by Stefan yesterday morning, and I was thinking about certain difficulties with establishing the cult of St. Canute, and in a way, it's quite frequently more difficult, it seems to me, to be an active king and a saint. So that's why I'm asking the question.
Well, honestly, I would say I didn't think about it in that way, never. It's an interesting question, but from my perspective, I would say that it doesn't matter really. There are, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that there are some periods when the female sanctity is more important, and some situations when female or male sanctity is more important. But I wouldn't say there is a general rule that it is easier to promote a female or male saint.
Thank you. Other questions? Grzegorz.
Thank you. So if I can make a just short comment to that, I would say that it's maybe quite surprising that in Silesia there was a potential, as you mentioned in your paper, to create such a royal male saint in the person of Hedwig's own son. So
Yes.
Henry, who was a martyr, who was presented as a martyr, he died in the battle against Tatars. So, but his cult never really developed. But this is, in fact, this question Robert asked is very much related with David's paper as well, and that's my question, in fact, because you stress, David, this element of the hagiography, at least some part of hagiography of St. Wenceslas, which I always find very, very interesting, namely this sort of a tension between his position as a ruler and his sanctity, which is especially clear when one looks to this scene when he refused to participate in blood judges, yes, and he don't want to be a judge. So my question would be, in what extent do you believe that St. Wenceslaus could be treated as some sort of an example for future Bohemian dukes? Because obviously he was a ruler, but he was some sort of a special ruler. He was, as I think Graus called him, in fact, the ruler who was a monk, in fact. So, you know, could he be at all a model for a ruler?
Thank you, Grzegorz. Well, you are right. I think the hagiographers in general struggled with the imaging of the royal signs, be it male or be it woman, because they had to develop the catalog of virtues that could have stayed specific for those people, but when they were writing, the most of the holy men were monks and bishops. So maybe that's why they started with mirroring those potential models, because or potent models, because they were experimenting, and what I found remarkable, and it was already noted by František Graus, you mentioned that when he compared to Holy Queen from the 6th and from the 10th century, he noticed that in the first case, the queen, the Merovingian queen, succeeded and became a nun, and he preferred the life in the monastery. But when the hagiographers of the 10th century discussed Saint Matilda, they presented her as an active queen. So maybe the monastic elements identified by Staber and other researchers should have just demonstrated the discipline, but we can see in all the Wenceslas legend strong stress on the fact that at the end Wenceslas preferred his active role as a prince. He never resigned on his office. He was aware of the fact that he might not punish the people or sentence them to death, but there were several places when the hagiographers write that he had no problem to punish the people by his own head when they transgress the God's law, because he felt responsible for the salvation of his people, and this was more important than seeking for his own perfection. So this I find as an important element, which makes also a difference between the legends of Saint Wenceslas and several legends about Anglo-Saxon king recorded by Beda the Venerable, because they're the Anglo-Saxon kings, or many of them, went to Rome, became monks, and resigned on their office. In case of Saint Wenceslas, his princely responsibility is important for him, and for the community he represents. And this might also have helped to establish his position as a patron of Bohemia. Yeah, it's a hypothesis built on hypothesis, and it will be very difficult to prove it fully, but maybe you find it convincing.
Thank you, David. Other questions? Jan Vidar.
Thank you. I have basically this same question to both of you. What about the miracles? Could you tell us a little bit about the miracles these two saints are actually working? And the numbers, please, if you have any information about that.
Jan Vidar, could you repeat the question?
The question is basically about the miracles. And what kind of a miracle did these two saints perform?
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to
Ladies first, or shall I start?
Okay. So, okay. If I understood your question correctly, there are similar ways, yes, of
ways in which the saints perform.
Different saints in which the saints perform, yes? Okay, so, well, now I'm thinking how to answer your question. In this, I'm not sure if my answer would be satisfactory, but I will try to answer it all the same. So St. Hedwig is performing certainly in some different ways, in some different areas. So, for example, she's a promoter of in a hagiographical in a hagiographical sources. She's a promoter of new trends of piety. So she's concerned about the poor, about those who are needing help. She's symbol of humility, and so. As we are looking on the hagiographical tradition, we can say that it's difficult to see her as a dynastical saint in the classical in the classical manner, as I would say. It's not a classical model of a dynastic saint. But on the other hand, we can see that her role as a patron and as a defender of Silesian duchy is rather a creation of her family members, I would say. In the hagiographical texts, she's really not so much concerned about the duchy. She's rather concerned on the on her own salvation, on the help for the poor, and and to create a dynastic saint, so her daughter and her family is really trying to I would say, push her in the model of a dynastic saint and to promote her as a defender, of the duchy. She's of course concerned about her husband, her son, but she's well. She's rather happy that her son is dying in the Battle of Legnica, because he's going to be a martyr now. And this is, I think, the only passage when she is referring to the, well, I would say, political situation of the duchy. Yes, that's what.
David, would you like to add something to this?
Yes, if I understood correctly, the question was about miracles. So there are mostly healing miracles at the beginning, and the people who are healed are requested to go to Prague and visit the grave of Saint Wenceslas. I haven't mentioned that the bishop cathedral in Prague was dedicated to Saint Vitus, Saint Wenceslas, and Saint Adalbert in the 11th century, or since the 11th century. There are some miracles related to freeing people from prison and from death, and there are also miracles however not mentioned in hagiography, but mostly in his Bohemian medieval historiography by Cosmas of Prague and his continuation, where Wenceslas either prevents the struggle among the members of the Przemysli dynasty, or stands as a supporter by the Bohemian army against the enemies. So he helps in battle, and at the beginning of that of these battle miracles is probably the story from Legenda Christiani, which is recorded in its last chapter, where Wenceslas goes with his army and wants to fight with the Duke of Kozin, and at the end they agree that there will be no battle, but it will be just a personal duel among the dukes, between the dukes. And when they start fighting, the Duke of Kozin sees the golden cross appearing above Saint Wenceslas and stops fighting and acknowledges the Wenceslas' victory and his superiority. So this is the main catalogue of the miracles, and part of which could be seen as supporting his role as a patron of Bohemia.
I would add that as it concerns Hedwig and her miracles after her death, these are rather the miracles in which Hedwig is healing the different illnesses. But I would say nothing more.
Thank you. Other questions? We have still 7 minutes. Yeah, please.
Sorry, better late than never. Yeah, I know, but if I can ask people just to come here and ask questions from there, sorry for that. But obviously there is some problem with people sitting there to hear questions from the room. So if you can come here and ask, sorry for this disconvenience, but I think we'll proceed this way.
Okay. So my question is about the miracles that you mentioned. Were the people being healed, for both of you, more local people, or was it national, even like supernatural, supranational healings? People coming from outside the duchy or outside the kingdom?
So, as it concerns St. Hedwig, I would say it's rather local, but in her hagiography it is stated that the cult is spreading very quickly, and more and more pilgrims are coming to her grave. So I would say we could find also some examples of people who are coming from outside Silesia and receiving her help, but at the tomb of a saint.
David?
Okay. Well, healed people are not just from Bohemia, but from neighboring regions as well. And I think the authors use them to stress the importance of Prague and the grave of St. Wenceslas, because, as mentioned above, those people are asked to visit the main church related to the cult of St. Wenceslas. So it's maybe more interesting for them. Let people go from a distant region to Prague, because it shows that the holiness of St. Wenceslas radiates above the borders of Bohemian Principality.
Thank you, David. Still 4 minutes until a coffee break. And so if I can use some of these 4 minutes, David, you are talking about slightly different purposes of the different versions of the legend, and I wonder whether you would risk to define different audiences, intended audiences, in specific versions.
Thank you. That's very interesting and important question. Well, as we all know, the audience of the Latin legends was limited, or once the secular elite wanted to understand it, they needed someone who will translate it to them or explain them what they exactly hear, which is not the case by the Old Church Slavic text, because this was understandable. But yes, that might be an explanation, because first, Old Church Slavic legend could be read as a warning to the secular elites. Hey, behold, you have to be trustworthy and loyal to your prince, because otherwise you are similar to Judas, who betrayed Jesus Christ. That's one of the messages we can read, not between the lines, but explicitly mentioned in the text. Problem is that we have only late manuscripts, and when I have shown him that ping pong between the legends and small differences between them related, for example, to the definition of the relationship between the Přemyslit and emperors, there is a problem with manuscript transmission, because as I mentioned, most of the text we have until 1200 was not written in Bohemia and Moravia, or at least we are not able to prove it. And where we are able to prove it, we can be quite certain that they were copied in Bavaria. So, I think in case of Crescente, the monastic audience and the relationship with Bavaria is quite probable. By Legenda Christiani, I think it's closely related with the situation of the Czech lands at the end of the 10th century. And this might be also explanation why the text was so rare, why we don't have any copy from 10th or 11th century, or full copy from 12th or 13th century. Because the ambitions presented by that legends are do not correspond with the political position of Přemyslit and of the Czech lands in the 11th century, after the crisis of the Přemyslit Principality. So maybe there was one text left and used from time to time, but forgotten. Gumport, yeah, that's for external audience. But again, we have a manuscript ordered by Queen Emma, which was wife of Boleslav II. We could have seen that it strongly stresses the relationship between the Czech lands and emperors, and the importance of the emperors for Christianizing Bohemia and for installment of princes of Bohemia. But it seems that question was not that important for the emperors. So that's why it wasn't copied that often, and Wenceslas was probably not that important for the emperors either. So therefore we have just one Emma's manuscript about which Dušan Třeštík thought it was intended as a gift for Henry II, the emperor that helped to reinstall the Přemyslids on the throne of Prague. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I cannot see any raised hands, but let me say that, as everybody knows, the session just after the conference dinner is a most challenging session for the speakers. So before we go for a coffee break, please join me in saying thank you to our speakers who met this challenge so well. Anna, David, thank you very much.
So we will follow the regular schedule, say, right now, and I would kindly ask you to follow this procedure during next two sessions. I mean, asking question or participating in discussion from here. Sorry again for this convenience.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. We have to start. Good morning. I'm Paweł Żmudzki. I have to lead this session. Let me introduce the program of our session. There are two lectures. The first, Kacper Bylinka, The Cult of Science as Constructing Elite Identity in Medieval Peripheries. And the second, Daria Segal, Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon Saints in the Old Church Slavonic Litany of All Saints and their connection to the royal genealogy of Rurikovici. Kacper Bylinka, please.
Thank you very much. Well, at the very beginning, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to deliver a paper at the conference. It is a real honor for me to give a speech among such eminent researchers. And it is also a great opportunity for me, a researcher, starting his own work on a PhD thesis, since I am a first-year student at the Doctoral School of Humanities at the University of Warsaw. So it really is a great opportunity to share and confront with you my research ideas, which I will be dealing with for the next 4 years. My paper, despite the rather enigmatic title, will in fact be a presentation of the project of my doctoral dissertation, which of course requires some clarifications of the issue specified by the topic. However, before I go into that, I must admit that my work is not at the very advanced stage today. In fact, for now I'm collecting and selecting a research material. So don't be surprised that I will often use the future tense today. On the other hand, I will try to present my methodological assumption as clearly as I can for today, and also I will outline some problems that I have already encountered or I think I will have to come across during my research. And afterwards, I will try to indicate how I would like to solve them. At the same time, I would like to point out right now that I will be very grateful for any suggestions and constructive criticism, and especially the second one. So, what is my research about? Sorry. Okay, what is my research about? In one sentence, I focus on the issue of the receptions of the cult of saints by elites on the periphery of Western Christianity in the context of constructing their own identity from the 10th to the 13th century. As you probably realized, there are many terms in that sentence that require a few clarifications. And even if they would seem trivial or even naive, at my stage of the work, I feel obliged to refer to them. For example, what elites? What does the term periphery mean? How do I understand the identity? How could it be constructed in relations to the cult of saints? What methods should I use to test such identity? And where does this chronological range of the phenomenon I am studying come from? All these issues and the answers to the questions are, in a way, interdependent. So, to start with, the term periphery, and above all, its geographical aspect. About its cultural dimension and meaning of it for my work, I will be speaking in a moment. So, the geographic aspect basically covers the regions defined in the conference topic, the so-called Central Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. Thus, the lower chronological frame of my work will be determined by the acceptance of Christianity, the conversion, in the countries located here, like Hungary, Norway, or Poland. It should be emphasized that within the geographical perspective I have adopted, that process started at similar time. And this similarity will, in a way, be a starting point for me in a comparative analysis of these regions. Generally speaking, the cult of saints, as one of the important factors in the conversions to Christianity, was gaining popularity among the elite rather quickly at that time. This dynamics of the phenomenon is quite well illustrated by the fact that almost each of the countries mentioned, not only soon after the conversion obtained in one way or another its own main saint, but also that the elite of the periphery participated in the widely understood cult of relics and cult of saints as well. So, however, putting this aside for a moment, short definitions should be also added. I understand the elite here as a group that stands out from among the society, which has a significant influence on power and the creation of ideas functioning in society. Thus, in my work, I would like to present it collectively, without dividing it into a secular or spiritual elite. Although it is closely related to Brian Stock concept of textual communities, which seems to me to be quite helpful in this type of research. But before I go over to it, it is worth briefly consider the problem of this division of the elite. Well, I assume that in the period of my interest, and in particular with regard to the cult of saints as a certain tool in constructing one's identity, this division does not fullify its role. So the ruler, king or prince, but also the broadly understood aristocracy, usually not only influenced the church structure in their country, but also participated in the values of the cult of saints. It was not uncommon for them to initiate the promotion of the cult of a particular saint. It's enough to recall the examples of Saint Wenceslaus, whose cult was actively promoted by his murderer and brother at the same time, the Bolesław I of the Bohemia, or Saint Wojciech Adalbert, and respectively the Bolesław the Brave. So, we see quite well the involvement of lay people in the cult of saints, which could be considered as a manifestation of identity among those who receive miracles through Saint Stanislaus. In his Miracula from around the half of the 13th century, or in the Vita Major, which was composed a little bit later, where these miracles were also included in the content, 3 times, for example, the family from Moravich, the Moravich, are mentioned. A certain Goslaus de Moravich, the Vir Nobilis Smil de Moravich, or Martinus, also Vir Nobilis de Moravich. In any case, I would say that the interdependence, the mutual dependence between the two groups and the elitism of the cult of saints on the general level allow us to depart from this division. On the other hand, however, a problem that I will have to deal with is the fact that right after the adoption of Christianity in the vast majority of countries that interest me, the church structure was based on strangers, namely the vast majority of the first bishops, abbots, etc., sometimes also their successors, in the periphery did not come from the local society, but rather came from the West. It is important, as I would like to primarily focus on the perception of the cult of saints by local elite, and not on a kind of symbolic resource offered to the local elite by the immigrant, the import elite. The fact is, however, that in my thesis, I will have to limit myself to a certain number of cases, which, due to the specificity and the number of sources, I truly believe I will manage to place those in a local context. But let's get back to the chronology of my work. The upper limit of my research also requires a few words of comment on my part. So, the 13th century and its end in particular is characterized by the massification, popularization of the cult of saints beyond the social elite, which should also be associated with the development of the mendicant orders like Franciscans and Dominicans in the territories of my interest. Moreover, then the identity of pre-modern and some kind of centralized state organism is formed. The changes taking place then in the whole Christian Europe, namely the Gregorian reform, the issue of the papal canonization, new trends in the cult of saints, such as the phenomenon of the cult of holy women, for example, undoubtedly do not make it easier to comprehend this period as a whole. However, I believe that such a broad perspective will allow both to fully grasp the phenomenon that I am working on, and it also justifies it is also justified in the terms of sources. So perhaps it is about the sources that I should speak at the beginning, although probably by mentioning Brian's stock concept, I could have made it clear that I was primarily interested in written sources. Although this concept is really a bit more complex. And those sources that come from the periphery have a local character. So in the context of the cult of saints, it is obvious that I would like to focus primarily on hagiography, but at the same time, not to omit the narrative about saints contained in other narrative sources. The hagiography itself also requires more detail here. Namely, leaves, miracles, or translations written locally on the periphery. Otherwise, there are some problems with achieving reliable results from my research. For example, the first two lives of Saint Adalbert, created a few years after his martyrdom, although they are a great source for reconstructing, albeit partially, the events of the contemporary two writers, I could in no way relate on their narrative to the issue that I'm dealing with. Both of these texts, one of which was attributed to John Canaparius, and the other was written by Saint Bruno of Pfefferfurt, were created from the Italian perspective, and we will not find there any attempts to construct the identity of the elite in the periphery. The case of the writings related to Saint Adalbert Wojciech is problematic on this point, since the first local text, namely a leaf called Tempore Illo, dates only optimistically from the second half of the 12th century. And of course, it raises some questions. However, returning to the sources in general, in my work, I will also take into account liturgical sources and material monuments, like in the form of coins. However, taking into account the second group of sources will require more time and reflection, because I must admit that I am not a numismatist, and in the end it may turn out that they will be unnecessary due to the large number of other sources, mostly narrative sources. Anyway, it is the text, the written word, that will be a starting point for my research. This is not the case with the Stock. He does not see the need for a written text. Well, he is satisfied with the phenomenon of the appearance of a given text and its mastering by a specific person. Nonetheless, in his phenomenal monography titled The Implications of Literacy, Written Language and Models of Interpretation in the 11th and 12th century, however, he emphasized the importance of switching to written text during this period. At the same time, he notices a certain mechanism of community formation around the text. Let us say that in my case, it will be the written one, where this community, where even illiterate people can participate in the values conveyed by a writer, whose main task is to reach a specific audience. Such an approach, which is de facto a recognition of the existence of a certain bond between the writer and the recipients, who can perceive the text in various ways, not only by reading, what was indeed something rare among some elites those times. So this approach would, in my opinion, apply quite well to hagiography, which Stock himself partially analyzes. His concept was followed by the continuator, Barbara Rosenwein, with her concept of emotional communities, which I will try also to include into my researches. However, such textual communities in the periphery would therefore use specific symbolic resources that should be clear and understandable to members of the community, to the extent that they identify themselves with the values contained in a given text. Although it seems obvious, I would like to emphasize it. When we say that, for example, the bishop legitimizes his position through the figure of the saint, like mostly relics or just a narrative text, we have at the back of our mind that this form of legitimization is something understandable with the rest of the community, apart from the bishop himself, can identify. This, of course, raises another need on my part, which I will certainly do as my work progresses, namely to trace the circulation of this text containing such values. I mean the manuscripts itself. In any event, this identity should therefore be viewed as a group. In the body of text that I have collected and analyzed so far, there are, of course, some exceptions. The best example, which I believe, is the fragment of Passio et Miracula Sancti Olavi, namely chapter 37, which contains a description of the miracle that Bishop of Trondheim, Eystein, experienced thanks to the Olaf. Well, he himself, as one of the main promoters of the cult of Olaf, was to testify that in this way, in Latin, of course. Ego itaque Augustinus, per voluntatem Dei, in ecclesia beati martyris Olavi, episcopalem ad tempus solicitudinem gerens, cum a magistro, qui operaris ecclesiae praest. Pro quibus dam in opere disponendis super muri fastigum euro carer. Pons in quo lapides trahebantur multitudinis quenos sequebantur, molem non ferens confractus cecidit. Peccatis autem exigentibus ut vitae et iniuncte solicitudinis cautior rederer, ceteris ponti et machinis adherentibus solus in precipum feror. Well, in fact, walking on a scaffolding is really a dangerous matter, but it is no less important how he, the writer, or Einstein himself, referred to Saint Olaf. Next, which I think is quite unique, as there is a term patronus meus. Although it would indicate a certain personal relationship, which of course it is not excluded, in my work, in such cases, I would like to pay attention first of all, to the overall view of the work and what symbolic resources it carries. For this purpose, I would like to distinguish 3 levels of identity, one which I would like to briefly discuss today in my paper, if I will have time, of course. These are successively the local level, that is a specific cathedral or church. The second one is the ethnic level, like we, the Danes, or we, the Poles. And last but not least, my favorite, the general Christian level, where the written text was used to show the place of a given community literally in the Christian world, and at the same time in the history of salvation, speaking in the language of Saint Augustine. At this point, I should return to the question of the term periphery, this time in its cultural aspects, what will allow me to explain this last level of identity a little better. I mean the periphery-center relationship. In fact, not so recently, because it was like 15 years ago, in 2006, Lars Mortensen, in articles in his editorship titled Making of Christian Myths in the Periphery, gave some practical remarks on that topic. He analyzed the narrative sources of saints from Hungary, Denmark, and Norway, and at the same time, he compared them with their earlier models and strongly opposed categories such as imitations, imitatio in Latin. Instead, he suggested several other categories such as likeness or contiguity, and as Mortensen put it, the peripheral centers and hence the elites associated with them wanted not so much to be like the center, but rather they liked to participate through their identity in the community of Christian states, thus creating a community on an ideological level. So together with other members, we are the ancient world, like he stated. In my work, at the moment, I strongly agree with his findings. What's more, this type of comparative analysis of narrative texts from the periphery among themselves without the center, without referring into that center, is also a key part for my PhD project. To illustrate what I have presented in theory, that's too fast. To illustrate what I have presented in theory, I would like to refer briefly, very briefly, to 2 examples of saints mentioned today and yesterday, Saint Wenceslaus and Saint Canute the King. So, when we take in hand one of the first local, whether we count the Crescente Fide as a Bohemian, hagiographic works about Saint Wenceslaus, which is a Legenda Christiani, through its narrative, we can perfectly see what Mortensen meant. This work begins with a kind of dynastic legend, the most ancient times when the Czechs still perceived themselves as Northmen. They lived sub Arcturo in Latin. So, in the course of the story, Christian invokes the figure of Boživoj, who was able to be baptized, and then the figure of Saint Ludmila, and afterwards he closes the story with the central figure of Saint Wenceslaus. And in this way, in my opinion, from a certain exclusion through identification with Wenceslaus, we should see in a way an eschatological story about how the Czech Republic found itself among other members of Christianity. On the other hand, very briefly, very shortly, on the other hand, the figure of Saint Knut, the Danish king, murdered in Odense, is in this context noteworthy, not only because of his special title, the Protomartyr of Danorum, which is referred to him in Tabula Otinensis, as well as for an interesting relationship that we see in the corpus of hagiographic sources devoted to his figure. Namely, in the main sources related primarily to the Odense community, practically every narrative text mentions the participation of Saint Alban, the current patron of the community. Well, this is how Knut, before his death in Passio narrative, he enters ad altare sancti Albani martyris. In the note with tabulae, he goes ante aram, while in the epitaph itself, we learn that eius et ante sacram sanguinis sacere fluit aram. In a nutshell, I think that we see a certain ideological continuity between the old patron, after all. Knut is also referred to as a martyr, but he becomes a more complete martyr, as he is to be the martyr of all Danes. On the other hand, it is interesting how in the Liber Memoralibus of the Lund chapter, the whole place, from the narrative, the altar, completely disappears from memory, which for Odense, I would say, was one of the key issues of the entire structure of this construction. So, to sum up, although on my paper today I focused rather on the great saints or of peripheral countries as a part of my work, I tend to deal with the smaller one also. However, today I just wanted to present the most important assumptions of my doctoral dissertation, which I hope at least partially was successful. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Daria, welcome.
So, being both on geographical and thematical periphery of this conference, and as well as the last speaker, I want to thank the organizers for the invitation and for putting together such an amazing venue. So, my presentation today focuses on the so-called Old Church Slavonic Trinity prayer, which has for a long time been overused an example of Scandinavian saints' veneration in Kievan Rus. However, the provenance and other aspects of the prayer are often left aside. In this paper, I will first discuss the complexity of the prayer and its internal division, then shortly go through the transmission and introduce the new text witness, and we'll follow with a discussion of saints and specific terminology set on the background of the late 11th and early 12th century. So, Tomasz Mikulka recently conducted a thorough study of the prayer, focused on the nature of borrowings and translations in it. According to him, the author used quotations from Byzantine liturgy, aesthetic literature, and even Greek prayers recited during the funeral rites on the one hand, while on the other quoted Latin prayers such as Confession of All Sins and Prayer of Saint Gregory. The Trinity prayer itself is structurally composite and built from 4 parts. The prayer to the Trinity itself, Litany of the All Saints, prayer for the dead, and confessions to all sins. The part we are interested in is a Litany of the All Saints today. So, in his conclusion, Mikulka follows the widely spread prayer conception that the prayer was written in Sazava Monastery in Bohemia. The peculiarity of this monastery is that it followed Slavic liturgy until 1097, where after Slavic monks were expelled and the Slavic liturgy was banned. Mikulka hypothesizes that the prayer must have been written between 1086, he dates the youngest saint in the litany to this date, and 1096, when it must have been reached Rus and subsequently played somewhat a mediating function between the translation of the Latin prayer of Saint Gregory and later produced Slavic monastic confessions. Such interpretation is appealing, especially since some relics belonging to the 2 royal saints of Kiev and Rus, Boris and Gleb, were preserved in Sazava Monastery in 1095, according to Continuata Monachi Sazavaensis. And some Bohemian saints are included in the litany. However, the youngest saint in the litany should be considered as Saint Magnus of Orkney, who was martyred in 1115. Of course, it can be considered that this Magnus is Magnus of Fussen or Magnus of Trani, but since this name is situated as a part which can be called Scandinavian Bohemian sequence, availability of alternative interpretations is quite low. Thus, while it is possible that parts of this prayer were written in Sazava Monastery or in the similar environment, the litany of the All Saints was most probably taking its shape already in Kiev and Rus. What is important here is to say that a list of saints is changed from text witness from one to another. So far, I have identified 11 manuscripts preserving this prayer. 2 of those, the late 13th century BAN 162 and 15th century MDA 332, are commonly employed in the scholarship since they were transcribed in the previous publications of the early and mid-20th century. Today, I will, however, discuss the overlooked manuscript preserved in the monastery of St. Ekaterina on Mount Sinai and commonly dated to the 13th century. I will not expand today on the dating and manuscript relations, but rather focus on the group of martyrs and omissions in the later text witnesses, namely female saints and terminology. So, there are 6 categories of saints in the litany, but only 2 will interest us today, namely martyrs and holy women. The widely utilized Western or Scandinavian sequence, including Bohemian saints as well, is the following: Vitus, Wenceslaus, Magnus, Knut, and Benedict, Alban, Olaf, and Botolf. The connection between San Vitus and San Wenceslaus, Duke of Bohemia, is not only geographical. Saint Wenceslaus, as we know, already built a rotunda dedicated to Saint Vitus of Prague, but also, according to the later legend, he received his relic, the relic of Saint Vitus. Together with Adalbert of Prague, whose name is included in the other category of hero martyrs in the litany, these names indeed highlight the Bohemian angle of the prayer. Another connection, as John Lind rightly underlines, is a sequence of Knut, Benedict, and Alban. This is a direct reference to Saint Knut's death martyrdom, in the cathedral dedicated to Saint Alban in Odense. Thus, it will be logical, as we have already 2 of those connections, to assume that there is some link between Saint Olaf followed by the Saint Botolf, taking also in account that Botolf does not belong to the list of the martyrs and should not be here. There are a few churches dedicated, there were a few churches dedicated to Saint Botolph in Denmark and Norway, but still whether there was such connection between Saint Olaf and Saint Botolph remains ambiguous and requires further research. Saint Magnus in this sequence should be identified as already said, Saint Magnus of Orkney, whose cult is, as it often suggested, might have been brought to Kievan Rus by other of two sisters, daughters of Mstislav Harald Vladimirovich, Ingeborg of Kiev, wife of Knut Lavard, or Malmfred, wife of Sigurd the Crusader, and later Erik Immune. Ingeborg, according to the 13th century Nidlinga saga, was present in Kievan Rus at the court of her father Mstislav Harald when she gave birth to Valdemar I. As it is known, Mstislav Harald died in 1132, and thus assuming that Valdemar arrives to Denmark around 1137, or at the age of 8, according to Nidlinga saga, he and his mother must have spent few years after Mstislav's death, either at the court of Yaropolk Vladimirovich in Kiev, who in turn wanted to make Mstislavichi his rightful successors, or at the court of her brothers, for example, Izislav Mstislavich. There are, of course, Kievan royal saints in the list, Boris of Gleb. However, there are also names of saints which are not very commonly venerated in Kievan Rus before the late 11th, early 12th century, namely Saint Pancras and Saint Pantaleon. The narration of the first is usually attributed to the time of Yaroslav Sviatoslavich in Baptism Pancras, the son of Sviatoslav Yaroslavich and Oda of Stade. Oda's brother, Burkhard, probably the provost of St. Simeon in Trier Monastery, was sent by Henry IV to Sviatoslav during the confrontation with his brother Izislav Yaroslavich. It has been speculated that Oda was the one responsible for the establishment of monastery of St. Simeon of Trier in Kiev. It also is important to notice that in princely onomastics, Pancras is not present apart from this instance. Another saint is Saint Pantaleon, and his cult should be connected to Gida, daughter of Harald Godwinson and mother of Mstislav Harald Vladimirovich, baptized further. There is a miracle preserved in the two Latin sources from the St. Pantaleon's monastery in Cologne, which describe an accident happened during the hunt with Mstislav Harald, who is miraculously after that healed through the agency of his mother and St. Pantaleon. It has been speculated that Gida, fleeing England after the Norman conquest, has stopped at St. Pantaleon's monastery for some time before residing at the court of Svein Estridsson in Denmark, and thus established close connection to this place. Unsurprisingly, the oldest son of Mstislav Harald and Christina of Sweden, Izislav Mstislavich, was baptized as St. Pantaleon. This baptismal name, though, does not occur in princely onomastics before or after this case, as well as Pancras. In Kievan Rus, the earliest evidence of cult of St. Pantaleon is a dedication of a monastery in Novgorod, attested in the royal charter of course, Izislav Mstislavich. So, coming back to the manuscript itself. Before you is the sequence of holy women with those who are absent in other text witnesses marked red. I don't think that you can see them. Starting with the evident identifications, there is Saint Bridget, and she is none other than Saint Bridget of Kildare, since another famous Bridget, namely Brigitta of Sweden, does not fit neither the litany's time frame of production nor the production of this text witness. Saint Eulalia is either of Merida of Barcelona or of Barcelona. At any rate, both saints are not present in calendars, prayers, or dedications from medieval Kievan Rus. Potenziona should be considered as Saint Pudentiana, She's a Christian saint, martyr from the 2nd century, and she is also never attested in medieval Rus. Interestingly enough, the later part of her name, Iona, was preserved in the later text witnesses, confusing scholars trying to identify this saint. So here are marked those female saints. Cults of those are not really attested in medieval Kievan Rus. So the other cluster starts with Saint Margaret. This name would not arouse suspicion in a person dealing with the cults of primarily Latin saints. Saint Margaret of Antinoch was known as Saint Marina in Greek and Church Slavonic writing, and her name is present in the litany among the former. The repetition of her name, while possible, if we assume that a scribe was not accustomed with her name in Latin, however, is unlikely, since the prayer meticulously sews together Latin and Greek words. The other Margaret that fits the time frame should be considered as Saint Margaret of Scotland. Margaret's ancestry has been much debated. She was a daughter of certain Agatha, called by some scholars the lost daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, while others emphasize her Hungarian ancestry. Regardless, Agatha was raised at the Hungarian court and subsequently married Edward the Exile. Today I will not expand on the complex situation before the Norman conquest, nor on its consequences. However, it must be pointed out that Queen Edith, sister of Harald Godwinson, and possibly her sisters, along with her niece Gunhild, daughter of Harald Godwinson, and sister of Gyða, who will become the wife of Vladimir Monomach, were educated at Wilton. Moreover, Margaret's sister Christina was an abbess at Wilton, and Margaret herself sent her daughters to be educated there. As Catherine Keane, who wrote a book about St. Margaret points out, it would have been highly unusual for Margaret to have been raised anywhere else. It would not be unreasoned to assume that Gyða and Margaret had known each other. Even though the cult of St. Margaret was promoted straight away after her death by her daughter Edith Matilda, it is still not clear how it would travel to Kievan Rus in the beginning of the 12th century. The list of saints continues with Scholastica, sister of Saint Benedict, Saint Evdokia, and what would appear as Saint Zoe of Rome. All three of them wealthy and noble women who invested their lives and or their money into nunneries. The last omitted cluster consists of Thecla, Pelagia, Medosta, Cecilia, and Ida. Here I would like to focus on Saint Medosta, or Modesta, and Saint Ida. There are several possible interpretations of these names. Of course, Saint Modesta can be of Nicodemia. However, other interpretations are also plausible, such as Saint Modesta, 7th century founder and abbess of the monastery in Trier. Considering identification of Saint Modesta as an abbess, the later Ida can also be considered as Saint Ida of Metz, the aunt of Saint Modesta, who founded another abbey at the 7th century. Thus, this connection would underline the previous mentioned Trier link. Such an explanation, however, is dubious, and other candidates for name Ida should be considered. Of course, taking into account that it is not only scriber error, which, as in the case with Potenziona, as already mentioned. As such, Saint Ida of Ireland and Saint Ida of Boulogne can be alternatives here. The Irish saint could have been appeared in the litany along with another already mentioned Irish Saint Bridget of Kildare. The existence of Irish monastery of St. Mary in Kiev, which was, according to Nazarenka, most probably a subsidiary of the Irish monasteries in Bavaria and Austria, is plausible. There are a few mentions of it in Western sources, and ask me if you want to know more about it. Alternatively, it can be Saint Ida of Boulogne, since she and Saint Margaret of Scotland were grandmothers of Saint Matilda, Countess of Boulogne, who was married to Stephen of England. Such an attribution will undoubtedly support that the emphasis in the litany is made on royal veneration. However, it is unclear, once again, how the cult of Saint Ida would make its way to litany. And both of these names are not present in the sequence. It must be pointed out, of course, that the list of female saints might have been transferred from Sazava or from the similar environment altogether intact, apart perhaps Saint Margaret, and thus linking to Kievan Rus of the 11th and 12th century is unnecessary. But there is another peculiarity of the litany, especially in this manuscript, and it is its terminology. Specifically, employment of the title Tsar towards a living Kievan prince. The later text witnesses do not preserve the term, rightly replacing it with knyaz or prince. In the Eastern Slavic sources, the term is used to denote Byzantine emperors and in biblical translations for God Israeli kings on rarely other monarchs. After the list of saints, the litany continues with, "O Lord, celebrate your faithful tsars and princes, and this faithful tsar of ours," name, usually it's a blank for a name, "and his king, and all their domain, and our bishop," also blank for the name. The example of the term's employment in the Eastern Slavic corpus are scarce and sporadic. There are only around 25 instances between 11th and 13th century. The semantic load of this term, likewise, is often debated. In the most of the cases, the term is used for deceased princes or princes martyrs, such as Boris and Gleb or Saint Vladimir, and also applied retrospectively. However, the later instances add another angle to it, namely the political power of the prince. The term falls from the usage towards Kievan Rus princes in the beginning of the 13th century because it starts to denote the members of Genghis Khan dynasty, but later it comes back, obviously. It is generally agreed that the term was not employed towards a living prince before the aforementioned Mstislav Harald. Izislav Mstislavich, his son, is called Tsar at least 3 times in the Hypatian Chronicle. Izislav Mstislavich indeed would present and in need of both religious zeal and political power, specifically in the context of Inter-Saint War of 1146-54. In 1147, Izislav, at the time Grand Prince of Kiev, gathered a council of bishops to elect the Metropolitan of Kievan and all Rus. However, it was done without blessing from the Patriarchate of Constantinople and generally was a violation of the canon law. Izislav nominated Clement Smalatic to take the metropolitan position. However, a few bishops opposed this appointment, including the Bishop of Novgorod, Nifont, who supported a rival of Izislav, Yuri Dolgoruki. Clement Smalatic was elevated to the Metropolitan See on July 27, 1147, on the feast of, already known to us, San Pantaleon, the patron saint of Izislav Mstislavich, and seized his position only after the death of Izislav. It is unclear, though, what motivated Izislav to ignore traditional hierarchical relationships, both in church and in domestic policy, especially concerning the succession. One can assume that such a period of unrest after the death of Mstislav Harald might have increased the need in additional ways of legitimization, to be that in the title of Tsar or in the saturated lists of saints. If we discard the hypothesis concerning Izislav and his involvement altogether, the other possible alternatives would be the rule of Mstislav Harald himself or the grandson of Izislav Mstislavich Roman in the later part of the 12th century, but it will take another presentation to discuss this matter. So, concluding, the discussed text witness of the prayer from the Mount Sinai once again underlines the multifaceted nature of the litany the litany's list of the saints. The presence of Bohemian and Scandinavian saints, as well as Irish and perhaps Anglo-Saxon saints, emphasize the unique period when such a blend could have been possible. In addition, the employment of the term Tsar in this manuscript emphasizes the need to additionally honor the ruling prince and underline his religious and political authority. All this, together with the dynastic connections of Kiev and Rus, allows to assume that such a period should be considered as the first half of the 12th century. Thank you.
So we begin discussion, and are there any questions or remarks? Please, but welcome to this place.
Just a question to Kasper about choice of Knut as the kind of comparative saint with Saint Wenceslas. Why Knut? Why not Olaf? Considering Olaf has vernacular and Latin sources, is there any particular reason why you chose Knut?
To be honest, not really. It was just some saint from Scandinavia, which I wanted to compare with someone from the Eastern Europe. However, I'm considering right now and also working on the comparison of cult of Saint Adalbert Wojciech and the Olaf Haraldsson. So it will come naturally in the way I will proceed in my work, I think.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Please.
So I have some remarks and questions to Daria, as you suppose, because I work on this text a little bit. I would have two comments. I mean, first, considering the source of the presence of those Western saints in Rus, I don't believe that they can come from one direction, from one place. Namely because we don't know anything about the cult of Bohemian saints like Wenceslas or Adalbert in Scandinavia. Neither we know anything about the cult of Scandinavian saints in Bohemia. So obviously there had to be two places from where those saints came to Rus separately. But it's quite interesting that they are joined together in this prayer. And I had suggested, in fact, already that in case of Vitus and Wenceslaus, it might be explained the same way as Lind explained those signs from Odense, namely that they were joined together because of the place of veneration, because Vitus and Wenceslaus were both patrons of the Prague Cathedral, and then you have Adalbert in another place of this prayer who also rested there. And this is especially clear when one looks to the tradition of Rus calendars, for example, where Vitus is always joined with his tutor Modest. And in this prayer, Modest is not present. There's Vitus and Wenceslaus. So obviously those two saints on purpose are together. So I think that the place of veneration may explain that exactly as Knut Benedict and Alban are together, and this is also, of course, the problem of Rus and Bohemian contacts are very complicated. Usually, it's explained by Sazava, but it should be mentioned, I think, that this information about relics of Boris and Gleb in Sazava is in fact the only information we have about Sazava and Rus contacts. So this is a long tradition of Bohemian studies, especially that's pointing out to Sazava as this place of contact, but in fact we don't know a lot about it. And just two more things. So first about the cult of Pantaleon in Rouge. So I would agree that probably it wasn't flourished, but it had to be remembered that Pantaleon was well known in Byzantium and that he is present in frescoes in Sofia of Kiev. Yes, so it is not like he was completely unknown in Rouge before Mstisław Harald. And one question, because I haven't simply followed that. I know that you mentioned that, but I didn't understand, in fact. Why do you believe that Margaret in this prayer couldn't be simply Margaret of Antiochia, which would be the easiest response, the easiest explanation? Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
The last one. No, sorry?
The last one.
No, I know that you mentioned that in your paper, but could you explain again why you believe that this Margaret in the prayer is not Margaret of Antiochia?
Okay, because, do you hear me? Simply because, as I have shown probably, that the prayer, actually the list of saints contains both Western and Eastern saints. And Saint Margaret was known as Saint Marina in Church Slavonic writings. And so Saint Marina is mentioned, is actually the third in the list of the female saints. So even though it is possible that the scribe who was copying the list of saints or translated it entered Saint Margaret because he didn't know that it's Marina, I do not really believe in it, though it's possible, of course.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Coffee break waits for us, please.
Thank you both for the fascinating papers, both. I have a question to Kasper. You were speaking about these three levels of identity, and you mentioned that you found the Christian, the most general one, the most fascinating. I would ask you to maybe elaborate a little bit more about the significance of this in these power dynamics that you are analyzing, and then, I'm thinking if you could maybe think of, or if you have even seen already some differences in how this Christian identity is being constructed in these two different regions that you are taking a look at.
Would you kindly repeat the last one of your sentence? Because
so if there are differences in the way in which this Christian identity is being constructed in the two regions or in these two contexts that you're looking at, so
that's the way my researchers are going for. So I cannot tell you anything about that today. I have only my guts, but guts aren't the professional research. So yes, that's the way I'm going to in fact also compare all of those codes. I didn't mention that, but I'm literally looking at the strategies of emerging of some cults, and by that I'm going to look for some maybe similar models of creating that identity through science, but who knows where my researchers are going to finish.
Thank you. Other questions? So we finished, and now begin the coffee break. Thank you very much.
soon, so you know. So this is my great pleasure to open the last session of this conference, which we'll start with hackies afterward, and then we'll go to some practical details. But first, Haki, the floor is yours.
So, how do I do this thing here when I want to put it on? How does this work?
What do you mean?
I mean, when so it comes on the screen, what do I do?
That's your presentation, or?
Yeah, it's just to kind of...
Yeah, so you just...
Oh, is it on now? Okay.
Yeah, it's already there.
Okay, so first I would like to express my gratitude for having had the opportunity to attend this conference and listen to all the wonderful papers. And on behalf of the participants, I take that out upon myself, express our thanks for the organizers of this conference and for their great work. Now, my role here at the conference tail end is somewhat undefined, but I know I must, as I say, sing for my supper, though I promise the song will be fairly short. So I think it might not be unhelpful if I place the individual contributions within a kind of larger whole to draw out some of the common threads running through them, and to highlight, where appropriate, the potential comparative angles. Now, as I'm sure you all know, bringing together experts in the history of Scandinavia and Central and Eastern Europe is not a new thing to do. And I refer to this familiar volume published in 2007, I think it was, Christianization and the Rise of Christian Monarchy, Scandinavia, Central Europe, and Rus. 900 to 1200, edited by Nora Berend. And I just happened to be placed in Cambridge, I think it was in 2002, when the members of the editorial board met there to discuss the nature of this publication. I actually thought I was joining a seminar of this kind or a conference of this kind, and then I realized this was actually an editorial meeting, which was slightly awkward for me, but extremely useful. And I remember the discussion the decision straight away was not to engage in direct comparative history, but rather to lay the groundwork for future comparative research. And this the contributors did by presenting the most up-to-date scholarship on specific, well-defined set of issues or topics, such as the earliest evidence of Christianity, when and how did royal and princely rule emerge and develop, when did the first bishoprics appear, and the Paris system develop. And of course, what were the earliest cults of saints and how did they relate to political power? And as I'm sure you all agree, this is a wonderful volume, which I often consult, not to speak of its value for teaching. But the central concept of connecting Christianization, and so the cult of saints, with the princely or the royal power, inevitably and understandably in the circumstances, somewhat underplayed the role of the elites on a sub-regal or sub-princely level in the whole process of Christianization, and for the purpose of this present gathering, the cult of the saints. Now, this topic received closer attention in this volume here, published in 2010, Saints and Their Lives on the Periphery, the Veneration of Saints in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, 1000 to 1200. Here, the role of the elite or the elites, whether ecclesiastical or secular, in promoting the production of hagiography and the promotion of the cult of saints was more in focus. The problem here, if I can criticize a volume which I bear some responsibility for, there were chapters on Scandinavia, of course, but other contributions only included the Rus. So we left out, among other regions and countries, Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary. I would also like to add that there was no contribution on Iceland in either of these two volumes I've just mentioned. There may have been practical reasons for this. There are not that many Icelandic historians, but I suspect the lack of royal authority in Iceland, the peculiarity of the state formation of Iceland, and the lack of princely or royal cults did not really fit very well into the central narrative thread relating to Christianization, emerging principalities, and the establishment of what we can term national cults of saints. Now, this present conference has kind of bridged these gaps, I think, with firm emphasis on the sub-regal elites and offering a wide spectrum in a geographical sense, with Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland, and Rus all represented. I think I'm not forgetting any region. Sorry if I do. And as Jon Vidar mentioned yesterday in his introductory comments, the Elites Project now engages in proper comparative history, where experts on Norway and Poland work and write together on individual contributions. One theme that has run through our conference is the differing and often competing use of saints cult by different factions or sections of the elite in a given place. Gregor's here examined how the nunnery at St. George in Prague, Castle Hill, where the cult of Ludmilla served the agenda of both the nunnery and the Przemysław dynasty. Carolina highlighted Casimir II's promotion of St. Florian, whose cult was kind of overshadowed by the promotion of Stanislas, also a martyr, but one which had been killed by a secular ruler and thus could serve as a saint who encapsulated the ideals of ecclesiastical independence and reform. And Stefan has shown us how the early cults of Denmark, that of Ljufdag, St. Knut of Odense, and Thomas Becket, served different purposes for different members of the ecclesiastical elite. The case of St. Olaf of Norway is, of course, a very obvious example of saintly appropriation by different, even competing factions within the elite. Here we find not only tension regarding ownership, so to speak, of the cult between the ecclesiastical and the secular elite, but also within the secular elite. So in the second half of the 12th century, competing claimants to the Norwegian throne identified and promoted the cult of St. Olaf. And as Leslie Jacobsen would have shown, the cult of St. Olaf served the elite in a different way, and less well-known way, I may add. He became associated with and originator, seen as the originator and guarantor of secular laws. And St. Olaf was seen as the eternal ruler of Norway, of his earthly realm, just as St. Wengeslas was seen as an eternal ruler of his realm, Bohemia. And David has revealed how the hagiographic texts on the saint, Wengeslas, legitimized different kinds of elites, both within Bohemia and abroad, over a long time span. To this, I'll just add an Icelandic twist. In Iceland, the two earliest native cults, that of Bishop Þorlákur and Bishop Jón, appeared around the same time at the end of the 12th century. These cults, as we discussed yesterday, appeared precisely in the period when the Icelandic elite had begun to divide into a secular and ecclesiastical elite, though they often came from the same families, granted. Monasteries had been founded from the 1130s onwards, and the old arrangement where the chieftains also served as priests was disappearing. One might therefore think that the two cults that appeared around 1200 would reveal a tension between the secular and the ecclesiastical elite. This, however, was not the case, quite the opposite, in fact. The two cults became a focal point and a shared experience for members of the whole Icelandic elite, and it cut across whatever tensions or differences there may have been between the bishoprics, or at least this is what the written sources convey. Thus, ecclesiastics from the northern diocese of Hólar played a leading role in the hagiographic writings on St. Þorlákur in the southern diocese. It was as though with these cults, the Icelandic elite reflected its own role in salvation history at one particular point in time, and quite consciously so. And this brings me to another important theme of this conference, namely the way in which the cult of saints, and particularly their hagiographic texts, are used by members of the elite to write themselves and the history of their monastery, diocese, principality into universal history. This theme has illuminated here by Sarah in relation to the Swedish saints, as well as Kasper just then there regarding St. Wengeslas and Knut of Odense. Both refer to Lars Boje Mortensen's important and influential essay on mythopoetic moments in early historical writings in Scandinavia and elsewhere. His emphasis was on native saints primarily, but Harald Hreinsson expanded on this model for us to showing how the importation of the lives of the apostles played a a role in forging the legitimization and identity of the Icelandic ecclesiastical elite, and the shifting understanding of the secular elite about its own identity. Here it's not the local, but the universal saints, if I can use that term, are foregrounded, as in the talks by Karen on the Marian cult in Hungary and Milos on the veneration of St. Giles in Poland. Indeed, Milos' talk reminded me of how important pilgrimage, especially to Rome and the Holy Land, was to the Scandinavian elite in forging its identity and prestige in Scandinavia. And this was a performative act, and so was, in a different way, the liturgical performance of the saints, which Karen elucidated so well yesterday. But we should also remember that the Scandinavian elite had extensive ties with the elites of the Baltic regions and Eastern Europe from the 10th century onwards, and Daria has just shown us one example of that, striking example of that connection. Another fascinating theme is the emergence in the 13th century, broadly speaking, of female aristocratic lay saints, whose sanctity is, above all, that of heightened spirituality and self-abnegation. And Kirsty talked about Elizabeth of Hungary, and Anna about St. Hedwig of Silesia. They both highlighted papal involvement in these cults and their association with the monastic and mendicant orders. So the Scandinavian equivalent trend would be the lay female saints in Scandinavia, that began from the late 12th century onwards, such as cults such as Margaret of Roskilde, Helen of Sjöfde, whose pious laity combines with suffering and actual martyrdom. Seeking legitimacy of saints' cults from the papacy is a theme that has appeared in a number of contributions. I myself have been interested in what could be termed spurious or downright false claims of papal canonization of cults in the periphery, particularly in Scandinavia. Cases from Scandinavia include St. Magnus of Orkney, Ellen of Skövde in Sweden, St. Theogarus or Thökar of Västervik in Denmark, and I believe St. Knut of Odense in Denmark, although some may not follow me in that particular, particular road. And the Central European example would be that of St. Stephen of Hungary. And I think this reminds us, these false claims of authority, that what we've really been talking about a lot is, in this conference, boils down to the elite's effective monopolization of information through various means. And lastly, I'll just end with this. I find especially interesting cults of saints that failed or were never really established, but have left some faint traces in the sources. And the Scandinavian sources, especially the Old Norse sources, there are many tantalizing references to such cases where the alignment at any particular point in time did not allow the cults to develop beyond an initial stage. Now, I had planned to discuss one example of this, but then I realized that it would be somewhat inappropriate to end a very successful conference on an unsuccessful saints cult. So I simply stop here, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Haki. That was really wonderful. I have to say that was a perfect afterward after the conference. So what we would like to do right now is to discuss some general points and to ask you for some general comments to this conference and to papers we were happy to listen during the last 2 days. And if I may just start to maybe encourage you to participate in this discussion, I would say about one thing I believe we managed to do, and which is a success, and one which I find difficult and maybe struggle for us. So the first would be that as Haki mentioned, we discussed quite widely imported cults, which I find a kind of a success, because usually scholars focuses on the native saints, and in this conference we have Esther, Haraldur, Karen, Miłosz, and Karolina who focus only on the foreign saints and their role. I think this is quite important, and this is something quite new in the scholarship, which is, as I said, usually focusing on the native saints. What I find difficult is that when I was listening papers during last 2 days, I noticed how different period we are dealing with. I mean, there is a huge difference between times until 1200 and then 1300. I mean, this last 100 years, it's really different, especially because I think of the role of mendicant orders and their influence toward the cult of saints, and that's what Esther paper especially shows very well. And another thing is, of course, the role of papacy, which wasn't a very important topic, in fact, on this conference. Maybe we should put some more efforts to concentrate also on that. But obviously, there is a huge difference between the role of papacy in the 13th century comparing, for example, with 11th century. So that's 2 points which I would like to notice. But I would like to ask you to share your comments or questions. Anyone? Yes, thank you.
So, I think this challenge that you mentioned about the difference between pre-1200 and after 1200 is something that, well, we hadn't really anticipated that until now, and I think it is something that stands out, and logically so. And I think this is perhaps something that we will need to develop a bit more in the volume. And I think it is interesting to note how the difference between Northern Europe and East Central Europe really stands out, because I think, from what I understand, the mendicant influence in constructing identities, constructing their own histories, their own institutional histories, is really more forcefully seen in East Central Europe than in Scandinavia, for reasons that I do not fully comprehend, because it's a bit beyond my scope or beyond my expertise. But I would like to, I would like to discuss that more, to see or to grapple a bit more with the role of the orders and especially the mendicant orders, and how they provide a marker of the difference between the northern geography and the East Central geography. It's a very open question. As I said, I don't have any concrete answers now, but I think that is something that we have really come very close to in these 2 days, to see how the 13th century really marks a watershed with a new era. The 13th century is really the mendicant century, and that is something that transforms a lot of ways in which, let's say, Christian identity is reframed in certain ways. They are Christian identities, or let's use the plural, identities, is drawn along more clearly institutional lines in a way that other orders rarely have, with the exception perhaps of the Cistercians. So I think that is where the big difference lies, namely in how the mendicant orders influence things. And I do not have the requisite expertise to explain why, but I would like those of you who have that to go into that. So please do that work for me.
Thank you. Anyone else? Right. So I think we can ask Stefan right now to tell us about details of the proceedings and what we expect from you right now.
Yes, I didn't expect to be back here so soon. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you for this conversation, for all your knowledge, for sharing your input, and it's been really interesting to learn so much about various aspects that, well, I, for my part, had little knowledge about before starting out. So thank you all for joining us, for making it. And as you know, we are doing this with an eye towards publishing a volume of proceedings, and in light of that, there are some details that I would like you to keep in mind. I will send this information in an email later, but it's the kind of information that really needs to be said a lot of times. So we have these main points that we would like you to keep in mind. First of all, the final essays or articles are supposed to be a maximum of 7,500 words. That includes footnotes, but that does not include bibliography. Bibliographies should be sent separately because we want to compile a unified bibliography, and quite frankly, we want you to do the work for your own article so that we don't have to trawl through all of the footnotes and references. But they won't count towards those 7,500 words, so you don't have to worry about that. The deadline for the complete version is at least now set to March the 25th. That might seem horribly soon, but we will reach out to you in the coming weeks with very specific requests, suggestions, and questions concerning the content of the papers. And of course, we know that the papers will be, the papers and the drafts that you have sent in, they're covering a lot more ground than what can fit into a 20-minute presentation. So we will take that as a starting point. But the point is that we will have a very close collaboration with you all. We will get in touch. We will ask to have meetings over Zoom, and we will be very hands-on editors. Because I believe that is we believe that is the perhaps most efficient way, and that's a way also to keep as much as possible the deadline. Of course, we do understand that we are still in a pandemic, so there might be various things that come in the way, and we have understanding for that. So please do not think that we are unapproachable when it comes to adapting or to make accommodations for various issues that may arise. But those are the main points. Have I forgotten anything?
I don't think so.
Are there any things that I should have mentioned that you would like to know about? Okay.
The only thing maybe I can add that probably we'll try to publish our proceeding with Brepos. Yes. That's what we tend right now. And it will be an open access for sure. I mean, that's required by Norway grants, so I think it's good for all of us. Right. Yes, so do you have any questions? Or? Right, so let me finish with some thanks. So I am, of course, very grateful. Oh, thank you, Haki, by the way, because we start details and proceedings, and we forgot that we had a wonderful afterwards. So thank you, Haki, very much for that. And I would like to, maybe I will start if you don't mind. So very quickly, and not to make that too long. So I would like to say that I'm very, very grateful to all of you. I'm very grateful to my co-organizers, of course. I would like to thank all of you for participation. I would say that I appreciate especially those who participate online because because one of the topic of the coffee breaks was how tired we are of the online conferences. So you are very brave that you decided to do that again. So thank you, David and Kirsty. I have to start my thanks from Karolina, who, as you all know, perfectly take care of all details, and without her, that would be completely impossible. So please join me with a round of applause to her. Thank you very much. I should also mention a few people who you haven't met at all, but we will be, with Karolina, totally missed in the bureaucratic procedure without Natalia Ostrowska from our research office in this conference, but also in our project. I would like also to mention Agata Ignatowicz-Bocian from the Faculty of History, who helped us with arranging the place for the conference, but also, quite surprisingly for us, it appeared that she is also trained and talented graphic designer, so she is responsible for example, for this beautiful program we have. And Mr. Leszek Nowak, who helped us with arranging the room, I would like to thank them as well. I am very grateful to Mr. Sylwester Kosowski and his teams of magicians, I would say, from PS Lite, who led us to have this streaming and contact with all online participants. So thank you very much. I hope you had a good time in Warsaw. I hope you will have a good those of you who are staying, that you will have a nice evening, nice afternoon, a nice evening. You'll see the city a little bit, not only this room, and have a safe travel back. And hope to see you all soon. Thank you.